The question which I was asked to speak about is a very sensitive question because it involves interrelationships, and sometimes we find that human beings are able to understand a principle and able to understand a certain philosophical concept, but when it comes to apply it in certain situations, it becomes more difficult. So I think that before we talk about the actual question of attending a Reformed temple to be at a ceremony which will celebrate a wedding, for example, any milestone of a friend or family member, I would like to first go back and discuss the foundation of the question, what it's all about, and then we'll be able to apply it really. We've spoken about in the very, very beginning that the foundation of everything that we talk about in these lectures, and it's certainly one of the 13 principles of our faith, is that the Torah in its entirety is divine. And one cannot separate between the written Torah and the oral Torah. They're both given by God. And if somebody will come to deny the oral Torah, for example, and to say that the written Torah is the only God-given law, the only God-given wisdom, and the oral Torah is not, is made by men, or it's not even true at all, we are basically destroying the foundation of the whole of Judaism. One of our principles is that Hashem has given at the same time, perhaps even earlier, because the written Torah was concluded in its entirety on the day when Moses passed away, and the oral Torah was given already from the very beginning. After the Ten Commandments were given 40 days later, Moses went already, he received the oral Torah on the mountain. And the whole time that the Jewish people were in the desert, they were studying the oral Torah. And the fact that we have, that our Yiddishkeit is based on the oral Torah, and there's nothing we can understand. There isn't one single mitzvah, without exception, that we could understand without the oral Torah. Some of them are completely, wouldn't be known altogether. Like, for example, the mitzvah of tefillin. The tefillin is completely based on the oral tradition which was given by God orally, or how to slaughter animals, or even Shabbos, how to build a mikveh, laws of family purity. All of these laws are completely our calendar. Without the oral Torah, we would have no Judaism altogether. But even simple laws that are so explicit, like don't kill and don't steal, the details of those laws would not be able to be understood without the oral Torah. At the same time, we also spoke about the rabbinical legislations, which the sages were empowered to be able to enact and to legislate. And that is our Yiddishkeit, as we know it. And if you take away that foundation, we're left without Yiddishkeit, without Judaism. However, throughout our history, there were many attempts to destroy the foundation of the oral Torah, and as we'll see very soon, indeed even the written Torah also. So to give a few examples historically, first of all, we have a group called the Samaritans, who altogether there are probably under 1,000 Samaritans in the world today. They have a tradition that they come from the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh, so they maintain that they're the only real Jews, but the reality is that Samaritans are not Halachic Jews at all. This was the nation that were placed when King Sancheriv, he mixed the nations together, and he exiled the 10 tribes of our people. He also brought a nation called the Kutim, the Kuthites, or as they were later known as Samaritans because they moved to Shomron. And because the land, according to the Bible, the land didn't agree with them, and they were devoured by animals, and they felt that it's almost like a sign that because they were idol worshippers, therefore they cannot live in the Holy Land, so they've converted out of fear. It wasn't a conversion for any for marriage or for any kind of a glory or honor. It was called Giyur Arayos with the Aleph. There could be Giyur Arayos with the Ayin, which means for marriage, and over here is Giyur Arayos with the Aleph, which means fear of lines, literally. And throughout the history, the position was somewhat clouded. We see a difference between the Mishnaic period, in the very beginning of the Common Era, when there was some question whether maybe there were doubtful Jews or not, but later on, already in the time of the Amoyroyim, in the Gemara times, a couple of centuries later, the status was completely clarified, that they were not Jewish in fact. And today, I'll mention later, they live today in two places in Israel. They live in the city of Chulon and in the city of Shechem, or as they call it, Nablus. And they worship on Har Grizim. Har Grizim is the mountain that we'll talk about in this week's parsha. They don't believe in Jerusalem. They don't believe in the whole of Tanakh. They believe basically in 5 books of Moses and the book of Joshua. That is the extent of the connection to the Torah. And I'll come back to them and about my encounter with them a little bit later. That was the first group. The second group that started to deviate from the norm were called the Tzedukim, the Sadducees. They first mentioned in the Ethics of Our Fathers. They evolved from one of the students when the Second Temple was rebuilt and the great Sanhedrin, called the Knesset Agdola, the Great Assembly, was formed and founded. There was somebody called Tzodok, and his students were called Tzdukim. And they began, eventually, they're very prominent in the times of Hanukkah, and all of the times preceding, we're talking about from the times of the beginning of the Second Temple for the first centuries. And they basically came along and they said, listen, we believe in the Bible, we believe in the Torah, but we don't believe in the rabbinic tradition. That's what the Sadducees. A lot about them is spoken about in the Talmud and in the Mishnah, the Gemara, but somehow they became extinct. We don't hear about it in later periods. And then it came about that after the Talmud was completed, and there was a period in our history, mainly in Babylon, called the period of the Geonim. There was a specific post-Talmudic period when there were two types of leaders. There was the Gaon. The Gaon was the great scholar who led the academies. They were called the Geonim, all of the such leaders. And there was the Reish Galusa, literally the head of the exile. He was more of an administrative leader who replaced the Jewish king, so to speak. And they were always descendants of King David, or at least they were supposed to be. And in the 8th century, in the 700s something in the Common Era, there was a fight over a position of Reish Galusa. Reish Galusa, his name was Shlomo, passed away, and he left 2 potential claimers to the throne of that position. One was called Hananiah, one was called Anan. Hananiah got the position, which was backed by the government at the time, by the empire. And Anan was very upset, and he started a rebellion. The rebellion was perceived by the authorities, not just a rebellion against the Jewish structure, but also against the government. And he was placed in prison. And it's a little bit ambiguous exactly how it happened. There's a bit of a suggestion that maybe his lawyer, who tried to save him from a capital punishment, suggested to him that it would be a good idea to claim that if they are Jewish people, then they are trying to shake the establishment. But to say that there's a whole new, different religion. And they started a religion called the Karoyim, or the Karaites, Karaim in Hebrew. And this Karaim, which exists till today, till our times, they began a similar philosophy of the Sadducees, of the Tzdukim. And they basically said that we believe in the Bible, in the 5 books of Moses and the whole of Tanakh, but we deny the oral tradition. They claimed that they began much earlier, but the reality is they began in the 8th century. And in the beginning, because at that time there was only the Talmud, which was a very difficult book for the masses to grasp. It was before books of codes of law were written, and there was a lot of ignorance among the masses. And the Karaites, as a matter of fact, they were even stricter in many things, as far as the ritual is concerned, were stricter than the, as we call them, the Rabbanim, those who followed the rabbinic tradition. For example, they had to have some kind of a tradition. It's impossible to have a system built just on the 5 books of Moses. I spoke about the fact that it's too cryptic, it's written like a code. So you have to be able to decipher it. So you need a tradition. We have a very elaborate tradition that has a system both of the direct laws which were given over, as well as certain types of principles how to decode the codes. They didn't believe in all of that. They just developed a oral tradition based on a very literal understanding of the Torah. So for example, it says in the 5 books of Moses, Lo sivaru eish b'chol moshvei sechem be'or Shabbos. Don't light fire on the Shabbos day. So they took it in a literal sense that you cannot have any fire in your house. Even if you lit it before Shabbos, you cannot have it on Shabbos. So they didn't believe in for example, in lighting Shabbos candles. Apart from the fact that is a rabbinical innovation, they also believed that it's a desecration of Shabbos, because they believe the Shabbos candles, they continue to burn into the Shabbos day. They also didn't believe in the whole concept of leaving food, like we leave food before Shabbos, we cook food before Shabbos, so we'll leave it on a plata or on a blech, on a special kind of a covering. They didn't believe in that. As a matter of fact, according to some authorities, the reason why cholent, anybody knows what cholent is? Cholent is a special dish which was made from meat and potatoes and beans, which was cooked before Shabbos and left on a slow fire to cook the whole day. And traditionally, Jews eat it on Shabbos afternoon. According to some authorities, the reason why it became such a fundamental custom to have cholent on Shabbos, because that was the way how they could tell between a Karaite and a Jew. It was very difficult to tell them apart because they dressed the same, they looked the same, they all considered themselves being observant. So how could you tell who they were? If somebody wouldn't eat cholent, it means it was a Karaite, because they believed there was a desecration of Shabbos. So they had their own calendar, they had their own understanding of every single mitzvah, how to shecht animals, and so on and so forth. And for a while, for a couple of centuries, there was a tremendous of lack of clarity of what Yiddishkeit is all about. There were many of the masses that joined the Karaites because they believe that they are the stricter ones. They keep everything on a very, very fundamental and literal level. Until in the 10th century, one of the last Geonites called Rav Sadia Goyen, a great philosopher and lawmaker, he began a war against them to be able to teach the masses that Karaism is really a heresy and is something which undermines the whole of Judaism. And he was the first one that brought in clarity among the people that there is Yiddishkeit, there's Judaism, the real Torah, Min HaShamayim, from heaven, which includes the oral Torah, and then there is a sect which developed, a splintered sect called the Karaites. Later on, a few centuries later, in the 1200s, the Rambam, he made a second class. He wrote the first code, as we discussed in one of the lectures, and he dedicates a lot of, in different places, he takes many opportunities to be able to explain that the Karaite religion is not Judaism at all. It's actually a form of heresy. And as a matter of fact, just now, those who learn, one chapter of Rambam every day, there's a custom, a modern custom. It's like the Lubavitcher Rebbe made almost like an enactment, like they made a request from everybody to study Rambam every day. And those that learn one chapter a day would just study it in laws of tshuva, in laws of repentance, where he talks about the most severe prohibitions. And he talks about the types of people who are called deniers and heretics. And they have different types of names. They're called minim, apikursim, and kofrim. They were the 3 names that he gives them. And he says that one of them is minim, is the one that says doesn't believe in God, or he believes there could be many gods. Or he tries to create a situation where you pray to God through a intermediary, through something else. There's a multiplicity in divinity, which is heresy in our eyes. The whole idea of Trinity is completely forbidden. That's called minim. And then he says, you have also apikursim. Apikursim are the ones that deny certain principles of Judaism, the concept of prophecy and so on and so forth. And then he says there's kofrim. Kofrim are those that deny the Torah as we have it. The combination of the fact that God gave us the written Torah and He explained the written Torah in the oral Torah, in the Talmud and the codes, and the fact that everything that we have, all of the literature, is all given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. Anybody who denies it, together with the fact that God has empowered sages to enact legislations, that is considered to be a koifer, a denier. And he includes the Karaites in that particular classification. So it's interesting that the Karaites, like I said before, they developed their own books. Because I had to deal with certain practical halachic shilas to do with Karaites, I have some heretical books in my house, I must say. I do it for proper reasons. So here, this is one of the books of the Karaites. And if you open it up, you'll think it was written by some kind of earlier Rishon, a rabbi from the early. If you look closely and you really study it, you'll see that it's a complete heresy. But it's written in a Talmudic language, in a scholastic language, and they created their own code of law, how to be able to do things according to their tradition. So before I will go to the other splinters, I want to just tell you a personal encounter with them. Some 20 years ago, there were certain practical shilas of yuchsin, of statuses that I was involved with Karaites, and it's a very problematic because there's a huge amount of literature about them. There were actually two types of Karaites that developed geographically. There was one group that lived called the Crimean Karaites that lived in the, everybody knows of Crimea. It became famous recently with the politics between Russia and Ukraine. It's this small peninsula in Ukraine, and those who lived in Crimea, they also moved to Baltic states like Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia. That was full of Karaites at certain times. And they actually, in the Holocaust, they as much as they always claimed to be the real Jews, but in the Holocaust, they convinced the Nazis that they're not Jewish and they shouldn't be killed together with the Jews. And there was a lot of, a lot of attempts on their part to be able to dissociate themselves from Jewish people, as we also did. We never considered them to be part of the community. But there was also Egyptians Karaites. And there was a little bit of a difference between them as far as whether they married out, whether they accepted converts, which would make them questionable if they're Jewish or not. And there was a lot of different opinions about them, which I won't go into. But I wanted to meet them myself and to be able to question them and see, whether or not they've accepted converts into the midst and so on and so forth. So I tried to make contact with the Karaites. In Israel, there's quite a few thousands of them. All around the world, probably 30, 40,000 Karaites in the world. They live in San Francisco, they live all kinds of places. So as I was trying to get hold of them, by accident I got hold of Samaritans, and the head of the Samaritans, who was like the PR man. And he was quite friendly. His name was Tzadka. I think his name was either Yerachmiel or Yechiel Tzadka, something like that. And he invited me to come and to watch a ceremony called the Ketubah. Ketubah is a marriage ceremony. Again, I didn't mind going there because I don't consider this to be a Jewish sect. I'll talk about later on about going into a Jewish sect that denies the Torah. But with them, I didn't mind them doing whatever religion that they're keeping because they are not really halachically Jewish. So I've organized with him that he lived in a city called Chulon, in a suburb called Shchunat HaShamronim, which means the Samaritan suburb, Samaritan quarters, whatever it's called. And he told me to come at 4 o'clock, and he's going to travel to Har HaGrizim. That's all the ceremonies take place in Har HaGrizim, which is a mountain next to Shechem. And at the time, my driver in Israel was late. Rabbi Dubov, some people might know who he is from our community. He was a rabbi, used to come here for many years. And he was driving me. And there was another young man, a student called Yossi Weiss, who came together with us, who picked him up from Bnei Brak. And we're traveling down the road, and we got into this famous, it's called Kvish Gaya. We got into this famous traffic jam. And we came like an hour and a half late. It was like you could walk quicker. It was impossible to drive. By the time I arrived in his person's house, his wife said, "Listen, he already left, but he left the directions for you how to get there." So we had to go back on Kvish Ger, come to a junction called Tzomet Morasha, as they call it. And we drove all the way, and the more we drove, the more it became like all Arab territories. And finally, we came to a place called Kfar Tapuach, which is right in the midst of everything. And they stopped me, and they said, "You can't go any further." On the right was a sign to Jerusalem, I think 78 kilometers to Jerusalem, and to the left 15 kilometers to Nablus, to Shechem. So they stopped us, and they said, "Well, you can't go. You can't go any further." I said, "Look, I'm doing research. I'm a rabbi doing research on the Samaritans. I'm meeting with them over there, and I'd like you to give me a military escort." And they called up and they got me escort. But then I borrowed, at that time, people didn't carry mobile phones. I borrowed a phone, and I called up this gentleman, Mr. Tzadka, and he told me, "Listen, you missed the whole ceremony, but I'll send you a VHS tape in those days." Nobody heard of it today probably, but it's something extinct, called one of those video cassettes, and which on one side it was the whole ceremony of the wedding, and on the other side it was the Pesach sacrifice. They actually bring a sacrifice before Passover on Har Gerizim. Today you can watch it on YouTube. Today it's very simple. Those days it was like a very rare piece of footage. And he also told me I could interview him, which I did the following day, asked him some questions. There was more out of personal interest. There was no real halachic questions that I had about Judaism and Samaritans. But soon afterwards, I came across the Karaites, and I interviewed their rabbi in the old city called Moshe Dabach, and he told me a lot of interesting insights about the ritual and how they keep everything and so on and so forth. And it's interesting that Karaites, Samaritans live very separate from everybody, but the Karaites, they act as Jews, like you wouldn't even know. They talk Hebrew, and they don't publicize the fact that they're Karaites. So it's something which is very, very interesting, because it's also more dangerous, that the prospect of possible intermarriage and so on and so forth. And according to the Rambam and according to the Rishonim, at least the ones that consciously follow that system are real kofrim, the deniers of Torah. So those are the groups that developed, splintered away from Judaism, and they're not Judaism, they just historically fell apart from Judaism. But what's in common between them, that they all believe in the 5 books of Moses. They interpret it differently, but they believe that was given by God. Let's go many generations later and come to semi-modern times, 19th century, 1800, when emancipation began in Europe. Eastern Europe was still very closed and very, very traditional and religious. In Western Europe, they opened the doors and assimilation began, intermarriage started. The amount of people lost to assimilation is staggering. It's quite incredible. It's hard to believe how many people married out, how many people converted to Christianity in those days to enter universities. Many names are known. The Israeli famous English politician who reached great heights in the English hierarchy he converted. The father of Karl Marx converted to Christianity. But those are just a couple of examples, literally, of hundreds of thousands of people. And at that time, there was a movement that began within the Jewish people that called themselves Reform. And basically what they wanted to do, they wanted to keep some kind of a ritual, but without any kind of separateness. They wanted to really mold among the nations and not be different to anybody else. It began in Germany, and it was quite an extreme movement. To give you an idea of what they tried to do, they wanted to, from very beginning, they wanted to move Shabbos to Sunday, because they felt it doesn't make sense that we should worship on a different day to everybody else. They wanted to abolish circumcision. They wanted to abolish any mention of Israel in the liturgy, in anything to do with our prayers. Everything was changed. They wanted to create everything they called a house of worship temple, which till today, if you look at all the Reform houses of prayer, they're called temples, because the reason why they called it a temple, because they wanted to make it a very loud statement and a clear statement They were not waiting for any temples to be rebuilt in Jerusalem. This is our temple. That's what it is. And that was the reason why in the beginning they changed the name from a synagogue or Beis HaKnesses. Synagogue really means Beis HaKnesses, a house of gathering, a house of community. They called it a temple. And so this movement developed in Germany. It went over to the rest of Western and Central Europe. And at the same time, two other names were created within the Jewish community. One name, as we know it today, was called Orthodox. Why was it called Orthodox? Today we associate Orthodox with Halachic Judaism. Really, there's only one Judaism, which is the Torah, true Judaism, and it's not divided into any labels. But the reason why the word Orthodox was created is in order to create a very clear demarcation that this group is not reform. They're not reforming anything. They want to keep things. They want to keep things intact. They want to keep things authentic. And they became known as Orthodox. It was almost like a reaction to the other two names which developed. And the second name was called Conservative, which, even though in Australia very little is, there's very little known about them, and they play very little role, but I would say Conservative is a very important name to know, because for many years it created a tremendous lack of clarity about the status and where they stand among the Jewish people. Conservatives, they basically, aesthetically, they wanted to keep things closer to tradition. They wanted to pray like the Jews. They claimed they believe in Jewish law. They believe in certain type of authenticity of Judaism. But with time, it became very clear that not only there's no difference at all between conservative and reform halachically, they both are as heretical as the other one, but in a sense, conservative is much more dangerous than the reform, because at least reform, they called a spade a spade. They made it very clear who they are. And reform clearly announced to everybody that we don't believe the Torah is divine, we believe Torah is man-made, both the written Torah and the oral Torah. And therefore, it's up to us how to create our own rituals and how to do our own things. And today, even though with time, the reform movement, they a little bit watered down from the original extremism of trying to negate everything, to trying to change Shabbos to Sunday, and trying to abolish Bris Milah, and to take away any mention of Israel, or even solidarity with the rest of the Jewish people. They wanted to say that we are Germans of Mosaic persuasion. That's how they call themselves, of Mosaic and Judean persuasion. Basically, there was no. They wanted to take away from anybody's mind there's any kind of a closeness between the Jewish people. We are first and foremost people of the country we live in, and being Jewish is just a certain persuasion of our ritual. In America, where Reform movement became a very strong bastion, you can find today a tremendous amount of extremes, very, very aesthetic. I mean, it's all the same, but visual extremes. Anything from something more like, traditional services with a bit of Hebrew in it, to sitting down on Yom Kippur in a circle with guitars and playing country music. You'll find any of that. You'll find, but like I said before, conservative evolved over the years to become exactly the same as reform, with slight aesthetic differences. In the beginning, there was a lot of confusion. People thought the conservative was more like a modern Orthodox. They were Orthodox, but they're a little bit more on the modern side. But the reality is that they believe that anything to do with life issues, it's up to us how to change and abolish and adapt as we want. And again, once you come to the conclusion, there's no Judaism. Because once a person has a right to decide what's in, what's out, then the rest is almost nonsensical. There's no reason why anybody should say that should be kept in and that should be out. It's up to us to decide. Might as well keep nothing at all. And the one that really exposed them was Reb Moshe Feinstein, the great halachic authority of the 20th century. He came out with very, very strong statements against them, and he called them what they are. He used the same words that the Rambam uses: the kofrim b'Torah, the deniers of Torah, and apikursim and minim, and so on and so forth. And he said that halachically, there's no difference whatsoever between conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism. So this is basically where we stand today. Now, again, the fact that we say unbashfully and unambiguously that all of these movements are not Judaism. They are basically man-made systems that come and go as people wish, and they have no consequence in anything Jewish, whether it's a wedding, whether it's a divorce, whether it's a conversion, any particular halachic action which is done to achieve something of consequence is null and void if it's done through those movements, because those are movements that actually deny the authenticity and the divinity of the Torah, and therefore everything which they do is permeated with that particular idea. So, on one hand, we believe that when it comes to our interaction with other Jews, we are not judgmental. We understand that people come from different backgrounds. Most irreligious Jews in our day and age, they were born into non-observant families. They were never educated in the knowledge and the practice and observance of Judaism. And therefore, halachically, they are called tinuk shenishba, which means like a child who would be torn away from their family. You can't hold them responsible many times. Our job is to educate them with love and not to be able to be harsh with them. And this applies to many of the even Reform rabbis and conservative rabbis, those people that were not educated. It's not like once upon a time when they chose to break away from Judaism. They are a product of their education. So when it comes, we see over here a very interesting dichotomy. On one hand, when it comes to personal interrelation, there's no animosity, God forbid, and many of the Reform ministers are we're quite good friends with them. Some of them actually send me once in a while halachic questions that they want to know, and I have no personal, it's a very, very friendly relationship. But at the same time, there was different enactments created in the Jewish world, in the halachic world, that were created in order to make a very clear demarcation and distinction between real Judaism and something which is called kfir, which means denial of Torah and denial of authentic Judaism. And therefore, for example, from the very beginning, there was a decision made among the great authorities back in America, when there was a suggestion made to create a board of rabbis, a platform where all of them would sit together, Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative, and all of the great rabbis, without exception, Hasidic and Lithuanian, Ashkenazi and Sephardi. And by the way, when we're talking about different groups within Judaism, Judaism allows for different expressions of customs and opinions within Orthodox Judaism. And therefore, whenever we talk about different groups among Judaism, when we're talking about authentic Judaism, it could allow for different groups, but they're all part of the same Torah. So if you have Ashkenazi Jews or Sephardi Jews, Hasidic Jews or Lithuanian Jews, that's not in any way a question of one being right and the other one being wrong. Hashem welcomed different customs. There's one Torah, but the Torah itself allows for a certain level of expression within the laws of Torah. That's fine. But when it comes to take away the foundation, that's something else. So all the rabbis from all different types of Orthodox groups unanimously said that we cannot have board of rabbis, because to have halachic rabbis or represent Torah through Judaism on the same platform as non-halachic rabbis, progressive, reconstructionists, the many different names they're called, that's a statement. A statement that it's possible to be a rabbi, it's possible to represent Judaism by denying it. And that's something which cannot happen, because we believe, again, we separate our tolerance towards people and our intolerance towards a particular attempt to destroy, because the fact is all of these movements cause more assimilation and more falling away from Judaism than a lot of other factors. So that's something which we also have in Sydney. In Sydney, there is a across-the-board policy among Orthodox rabbis that we don't co-officiate. We cannot, for example, do a wedding together or do a bar mitzvah together, or do a bris together, or even a funeral together. We don't do it together. It's something that you cannot have a perception that there's two rabbis, one of them is Orthodox, one of the Reform, because accepting that is accepting the philosophy that denies Judaism. So once we establish that particular concept, we're coming now to a more painful and sensitive issues that sometimes affect families. One of the things that became also a given among halachic authorities, that one is not permitted to go into a progressive temple, reform or conservative temple, participate in any ceremonies, participate in any weddings. And there are two reasons for it. Reason number one, as I mentioned before, that this is what's called mokum hakfira. This is a place, by coming there, whenever you come to a place and you stand there, you show by your presence that you're giving a certain level of approval. Everybody knows that we all have a certain borderline of our tolerance. There's certain things we'd never go to because we can't accept a particular philosophy. I'm not going to mention over here examples because people may confuse that I'm comparing the two things, and people may misquote me on that. But everybody has a certain type of a principle, and a person will say that if there's a particular gathering that goes against my principles, I will not go there, because if I'm going to go there and I'll stand there, just my presence will show my acceptance of what's going on. And for us, for people who take Judaism very seriously, for us that is the case with any ceremony that happens in a temple. By standing there, you're making a statement that I'm okay with that. This is the place which denies the foundations of Torah. It denies the written Torah, the oral Torah. This is a place that will do ceremonies of intermarriage, of same-gender marriages, which is not permitted by Judaism. And therefore, by standing there, I'm showing that it's okay. I'm accepting it. That's reason number one. Reason number two is more of a technical, halachic, legal reason. When Rav Moshe Feinberg, we spoke about once that when somebody is married under a chuppah, they enter into a very, very sacred divine bond that can only be broken either through divorce or through death. And sometimes there is a Jewish marriage takes place, and for whatever reason, it's difficult to get a get. The husband disappears, the husband is uncooperative, and so on and so forth. And that creates a problem for the wife, for example. Now, in a situation when the wedding was not halachic, it was decreed by virtually the vast majority of authorities that in a situation when you can't get a get, the reason why we get a get is only because of a stringency, because by living together, there could have been another form of a bond which develops, which requires a get, according to some opinions. But Rav Moshe Feinstein said a very interesting thing. He said that if there would have been any question of religious witnesses being present at a non-halachic marriage, there could be an argument and there could be a reason to be strict in a situation when the husband disappears, for example, to demand a get. And the reason why we don't demand a get if the husband is not there, or we can't give it, or we can't get a get from him, is because there's an assumption that a religious person will never go to a non-Orthodox ceremony. And that particular principle and that particular, almost like a decree, saved a lot of women from suffering, because the reform and conservative marriages were able to be abolished, so to speak, and not to be counted as to have any kind of validity, because we knew that it's impossible that there would be religious witnesses who are qualified to be witnesses at the ceremony. Once we're going to break it, and once we're going to have people who are from the Orthodox persuasion, who are going to attend the non-Orthodox weddings, it may create a problem in the future for the women and for the potential offspring. So this is a particular reason why we're very, very strong about it. And whenever I'm asked, I'm very much aware of the fact that when it comes to family situations, there's a lot of emotions go into it, a lot of sensitivities. And God forbid that I would judge anybody who would not keep what I'm doing. But I'm here to tell you what are the official policy when I'm asked the question. So I'll give you an interesting example. I received a call, this going back not quite a number of years ago, maybe 10 years ago. I got a call from a gentleman in Melbourne, a doctor, who calls me up for different shilas, which means halachic questions. And he says to me, Rabbi Ulman, I'm sitting at the airport, I'm traveling to California, to San Diego, and it just occurred to me that I should ask you a shaila. My first cousin's daughter is getting married in the Reform Temple, and I'm traveling to attend the ceremony, and afterwards the reception. Am I permitted to do so? So I asked him if it's a intermarriage or it's a within Judaism, if it's a Jewish girl marrying a Jewish boy. He says, no, it's a Jewish girl marrying a Jewish boy. So I advised him, I said, look, I wouldn't tell him that he has to make some kind of a demonstrative statement by announcing that he's not coming. I told him, look, you're arriving on the day of the wedding. You can be late for the ceremony. But if, as they're making a kosher reception, and I made it very, very special effort to be able to make sure there is kosher food and make sure everything is glad kosher, so to speak, I said to him, you can attend afterwards the reception. And that's what happened. He told me that it never came to any point of contention because they knew he's coming from overseas. As far as they were concerned, they just, for whatever reason, came late to the ceremony, but he attended the reception. There's quite a bit more to talk about, a few examples that I wanted to give, but because we have other, even more sensitive questions of if a family member marries out, and so on and so forth. And we know that it is, on one hand, the advice that I always gave was always to never to disown a child or a friend or a family member, always to be close to them no matter what happens, and even to be able to bring close the partner, because this is the way not to lose people close to us. But at the same time, we could not allow, we could not give permission to attend a actual marriage to celebrate it, because we know that the one single catalyst and reason of the loss of so many Jewish people is intermarriage, and it's something that for us it's a very great tragedy when the marriage occurs, and therefore we advise the parents to find a way to show the love to the children, but to explain. And I'll tell you, I'll finish off with this story that happened very, very recently. I got a call from a rabbi from Los Angeles, from the West Coast, and he said to me that his sister's marrying out, and he wants to ask me halachic questions, what to do. He understands that he can't go to the wedding, but he wants to know about inviting them for Shabbos, inviting them for the family Seder. He said he doesn't think that his parents would be able to be strong enough not to go to a wedding. It would be too much of a conflicted situation for them. But he himself is asking the question. So I spoke of a number of conversations with him, talking to him on one hand how to show the acceptance of his sister, not what she's doing, but acceptance of her, that she always remain his sister, and to be able to make sure that, and anything that is not connected to wedding, to make sure to invite her together with a partner to the house. But I said a wedding, you can't, because wedding is an expression of celebration of what's happening, that you can't participate in that. And then his parents called me up. They asked me for a conference call, and they wanted to hear what I have to say. And I told them that on one hand, I would understand how somebody could be under a lot of pressure and emotional pressure, and I would never judge them if they would attend the wedding. But if they're asking me as a halachic shaila, I would try to use all of our emotions and all of our creativity, how to be able to find a way, on one hand, not to lose the relationship with them, but on the other hand, to explain that we can't attend the wedding. And they listened to me. They said that they will do it, but that they think there's going to be a lot of very conflicted situation. At that time, I was actually traveling. It was December 2019, or either December 2018 or January 2019. So it was before, like a year before COVID. I was in California, and we were staying in a hotel in the Jewish area called Pico. And I got a call from the parents, and I said, look, if our daughter with a partner want to come and see you, would you speak to them? I said I'll be very happy to speak to them. I don't know if they would want to speak to me. They probably think I'm the bad guy. I'm telling the parents and the brother not to go to the wedding, but I'll be very happy to speak to me. So they came to the lobby. We spent maybe an hour and a half talking, and within they saw that I'm not coming over here from a position of being judgmental or any kind of hatred towards them, God forbid. They saw that we're talking about over here very delicate, sensitive issues that are a foundation of Judaism. So one of the things, once we established a relationship and we became very friendly during the conversation, I told them, I said, look, one thing you have to understand, that your parents and your siblings will never ever will want to break away the relationship with you. They will always love you. You're the daughter, you're a sister. And you have to remember and understand that if, for whatever reason, they will do certain things together, and certain things they won't do, it's not because of any kind of a desire to punish you or to be able to be cruel towards you, or to be able to create a barrier or distance between the two of you, between you and the family. But that's because they could be limited with certain aspects of Judaism. And afterwards, I received a beautiful email from the parents. I said, we don't know what you told our daughter and her partner, but they came back different people. There was no any kind of anger within them. And they said, look, we'd like you to come to the wedding, but if you don't come, we'll understand, and we hope that the relationship will continue afterwards. So I know that I probably didn't cover the topic as much as I wanted to cover it, but I hope that I've given enough of the parameters and some of the understanding that we're dealing on one hand with very, very, very complicated, sensitive issues, sometimes talking about family issues. Again, I would never ever, what I'm saying now is only from Halachic perspective. That doesn't mean that I would go around and somehow try to judge or try to even put any kind of a negative opinion about anybody that felt that they were compelled to, out of family commitments, to be able to attend any of these things. And the limud zchus, the sort of justification of it is that nobody would think that when it comes to, again, I'm saying it separately from halachic, we're giving over here my own personal attempt to justify it, that when you see a parent, nobody would suspect the parent going there because they want to be able to embrace that form of Judaism or that particular act of defiance to Judaism. They are there only to be next to their child, and people would understand that. But now we have some questions.
All right, so we have a few follow-up questions from previous lessons, which people sent in through the website. I want to once again remind everyone that the website is up, rabbiulman.com, and over there you'll find a tab called Ask the Rabbi, where you can submit your questions. You can choose to submit them anonymously as well, so you can definitely send your questions there. So the first question we have is somebody's asking as follows. Hi, Rabbi Ulman. Can you address the topic of lab-grown meat? Is there a possibility of creating lab-grown kosher bacon?
Right. The question, again, I'll answer very shortly because there's much more that could be said about it. Anything which is done synthetically obviously has no connection to anything forbidden. So if somebody creates out of any kind of tofu or any kind of other products which are kosher, they simulate bacon or pork or crabs or lobsters, whatever it is, that's, of course, there's no question about it. The question which I'm asked is using the DNA and certain cells to grow that in a lab. And over here, that's a subject of much contention. But I subscribe to the thought that if the foundation, if the essence and the substance is from a pig, then it's something which becomes kosher. That's my opinion.
Okay, next question. What was the end of the story with the guy that married his wife's sister in Israel and had 9 kids? Was it possible to remove the mamzer stigma from them?
Right. Today, because I received the question last week and I wasn't ready to answer it. The reason I wasn't ready to answer it because I wanted to be historically correct. It's a factual story, so I wanted to be able to speak to the head of the Beth Din in Jerusalem, who actually was looking after the case. And I called him up today, and I spoke to him just to be able to remind. People may not have been there. It was one of the first lessons when we spoke about laws of family laws and some of the laws of illegitimacy. And we spoke that to be what's called a mamzer is either a child born not out of wedlock, that's not considered to be a mamzer in Jewish law at all. It's either somebody born from adulterous relationship, the way adultery is defined in the Halacha in Jewish law, or from an incestual relationship. Again, incest, the way it's defined by Jewish law. And some of them are in common with the civil law, so certain type of relationships such as a brother, siblings, or a parent and a child, that's something which is obvious. It's both in Jewish law and in secular law, it's called incest. But there is one particular example where in Jewish law it's a complete example of incest, as severe as anything else, and in the secular law it may not be a problem. In Jewish law, if a man marries a woman, chuppah v'kedushin, marries her under Jewish law, under Halachic law, and he has a relationship with her sister even after he divorces her, while she's alive. Now, was the only time that he could marry her sister is if, God forbid, she passes away. But while she's alive, it's irrelevant whether he divorces her or not. It becomes an incestual relationship, and therefore the child is a mamzer. And the story that I told as an example, and I didn't give over the ending, and that's why I'm glad that people listen and they catch on to it and they want to hear the end of the story. There was a true story that a young man from Morocco got married as a teenager, as was the custom in the community. The marriage didn't go well. He divorced his wife. He moved to Israel and he married a woman, and it was later discovered that that was his wife's sister. It somehow fell through the cracks. It wasn't the marriage in Morocco wasn't recorded or something like that, and the Beit Din in Israel didn't catch on to the fact, and they had not 9 but 10 kids. I found out there were actually 10 children, boys and girls. And it was discovered by one of the sons of a religious family, and was discovered by one of the sons who was studying in the yeshiva, and he found out that it's a problem. And I told the story, I found out some details. They actually brought out the mother of the 2 sisters from Canada. She lived in Canada at the time. She came in and she testified in court. She even swore on a telephone book covered by a newspaper that she thought was the Holy Zohar, the book of Kabbalah. She swore that they're not sisters. One of them was her daughter, and the other one was adopted. And then they wrote a tshuva to allow them to get married. To allow the children to marry anybody. In other words, they're not mamzerim, they're not illegitimate. And later on, she came along to deny it, to say that it wasn't a truthful oath. And that's when the question came up that I ended off the story last time. And the way that at the end of the day, it was permitted by Rabbi Ovadia Yosef and Rav Mashash, based on the fact that once it was already established that, first of all, there was a number of legal issues. I went through, actually, I have a copy of the response, plus I spoke to the head of the Beth Din myself today, and it's quite a complicated argument based on Talmudic and Halachic sources. But it's based on the fact that even in the very beginning, when they were branded as a problematic in the Beth Din, they weren't branded as mamzerim, as a legitimate. They were only branded as a suffix, as a chashash, as a suspicion of illegitimacy. And there was no conclusive decision made in the very beginning. So there was not yet any chazaka, any legal presumption of illegitimacy. And then there came the oath. And when a person makes an oath, it's very, very difficult to undo it and to be able to afterwards to come along and say the light, because that oath was accepted in court. So based on many such legal factors, at the end of the day, they were accepted as legitimate, and it gives you a little of inkling how much effort goes into every single question of Mamzerus. And as I told you in one of my lectures, that over just in my experience, I had probably close to 60 or 70 cases of Mamzerus. Approximately maybe 10 of them will go into my book that I'm putting out. And except for 2 of them, we're able to find solutions to virtually all of them. But again, we found solution in a halachic way, not just being nice and kind and saying, listen, we feel sorry for the people, because that's not Orthodox Judaism, that's Reform. We found a way by halachic arguments and sources to be able to find a solution for them. Next.
All right, next question. According to Halacha, is one allowed to be a vegetarian or a vegan?
It's a very interesting question. There's no commandment in the Torah that one has to eat meat or fish or anything at all, except for the fact that we have to eat matzah on Pesach. That's a commandment. But so technically, when a person makes a decision to be a vegetarian or vegan, he is not violating any commandment in the Torah. But there is such a thing called hashkafa. It's also very important to have the right Torah attitudes and mindset. And one of the principles of Torah is that the animal world and the world itself was created for mankind, for their benefit and for the purpose. On a Kabbalistic level, these are not really lectures on Kabbalah, on mysticism, but I must include a little bit of that. On a Kabbalistic level, we know that when God created the world, he, so to speak, is hidden in all the physical things which were created here. And all the physical things are called klippa, which means like a shell, just like a shell which covers the fruit. You have an orange, or you have a mandarin, and the fruit is covered by a klippa, by an outer shell. Similarly, everything divine in this world is covered. You don't see it. We look around, we don't see God. God is hidden. But there are 2 types of klippa. Certain types of klippa are forbidden things, are not kosher. They're out of bounds for us. We cannot elevate them. We can't do anything holy with them. So any forbidden relationships, any forbidden types of behavior, any dishonest behavior, non-kosher food, all of these things are classified as that level of klippa that we cannot elevate. We just, we live together with it, but we can't use it for our benefit in most cases. But then you have a lot of things that are physical, and we can make them holy. And one of those things is animals. And the 2 ways how to make an animal holy. One way is to, if it's either an animal or a bird, to slaughter the animal in a kosher way, which is the most humane way that exists to be able to do that. And to drain it from blood, to make it kosher, and to eat it by making a blessing on it, and so on and so forth, and not eating it as an animal. For us, eating is not just a biological pursuit and biological action. For us, it's also a part of our service of God. We don't just serve God in a synagogue and by praying and by doing certain rituals. Even when a Jewish person eats, it's also part of serving God, and that is the reason why we dip the challah into salt, to show that just like in the holy temple, they used to put salt in the sacrifices, similarly we put challah into the salt. So that's one way, and we are told if you do that, if an animal is made kosher and used for that purpose, and later it's and you eat it with a blessing and with a more of a sublime purpose rather than the just animalistic urges, when your person thinks to himself that he has a purpose in this world, and part of the way to fulfill it is by living, and the only way to live is to eat. So we're eating, actually, for us, eating is part of our divine service. So by doing that, you're elevating the spark, the holy spark within the animal, and we are told we're actually doing a favor for the animal. It's not just the animal may not have freedom of choice, but have a soul that understands what's going on, and that soul that gets a tremendous benefit from it. The other way to elevate it is by making a Torah or mezuzah, because they're made out of parchment from animals, or a tefillin out of these things, or Megillah. When you're using the animals for holy purposes, you're elevating them. So when a person comes along, and it's not considered to be cruel in Jewish law to be able to slaughter them for their purpose. For them, it's considered a tremendous, tremendous favor than rather to die and not to be used for those things. So if the soul of the animal would have a choice to be able to die serving a divine purpose, or just to die without that purpose, it would certainly choose that.